This is Exodus 2, verse 11 to chapter 3:15. One day after Moses had become an adult, he went out among his people and he saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. He looked around to make sure no one else was there. Then he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When Moses went out the next day, he saw two Hebrew men fighting with each other. Moses said to the one who had started the fight, "Why are you abusing your fellow Hebrew?" He replied, "Who made you a boss or a judge over us? Are you planning to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid when he realized, "They obviously know what I did." When Pharaoh heard about it, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses ran away from Pharaoh and settled down in the land of Midian. One day Moses was sitting by a well. Now there was a Midianite priest who had 7 daughters. The daughters came to draw water and fill the troughs so that their father's flock could drink. But some shepherds came along and rudely chased them away. Moses got up, rescued the women, and gave their flock water to drink. When they went back home to their father, Reuel, he asked, how were you able to come back home so soon? Today. And they replied, "An Egyptian man rescued us from a bunch of shepherds. Afterward, he even helped us draw water to let the flock drink." Reuel said to his daughters, "So where is he? Why did you leave this man? Invite him to eat a meal with us." Moses agreed to come and live with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses as his wife. She gave birth to a son, and Moses called him Gershom, because, he said, "I've been an immigrant living in a foreign land." A long time passed, and the Egyptian king died. The Israelites were still groaning because of their hard work. They cried out, and their cry to be rescued from the hard work rose up to God. God heard their cry of grief, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked at the Israelites, and God understood. Moses was taking care of the flock for his father-in-law Jethro, Midian's priest. He led his flock out to the edge of the desert, and he came to God's mountain called Horeb. The Lord's messenger appeared to him in a flame of fire in the middle of a bush. Moses saw that the bush was in flames, but it didn't burn up. Then Moses said to himself, "Let me check out this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't burning up." When the Lord saw that he was coming to look, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." Moses said, "I'm here." Then the Lord said, "Don't come any closer. Take off your sandals because you are standing on holy ground." He continued, "I am the God of your father, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God." Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, "I've clearly seen my people oppressed in Egypt. I've heard their cry of injustice because of their slave masters. I know about their pain. I've come down to rescue them from the Egyptians in order to take them out of that land and bring them to a good and broad land, a land that's full of milk and honey, a place where the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites all live. Now the Israelites' cries of injustice have reached me. I've seen just how much the Egyptians have oppressed them. So get going. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God said, "I'll be with you, and this will show you that I am the one who sent you. After you bring the people out of Egypt, you will come back here and worship God on this mountain." But Moses said to God, "If I now come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' they are going to ask me, 'What's this God's name?' What am I supposed to say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am. So say to the Israelites, 'I am has sent me to you.'" God continued, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your ancestors, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how all generations will remember me." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks, Lyndon. That was a long one. I remember being jealous of Moses when I heard this story in my younger days. I mean, this is like the cream of the crop of call stories. It's the ultimate one. I mean, who does not want God to call your name, especially from a botanical marvel like this? To tell you that she has an amazing purpose for your life and to lay out steps for you to actually accomplish that purpose. Anyone else? Like that's exactly what I wanted. I really wanted someone to tell me who I was and what I was made for. Especially as a kid who was in deep denial about being queer, I felt this sense that I really didn't quite belong, even though I was like the pastor's kid in this church. And I was compensating by striving to be perfect at everything. That was my sort of strategy. But I didn't have a good sense of what I wanted to do with my life. And it would have meant a lot to hear God say, Beth, just like he said, Moses, Moses, to call me by name and to help solve this crisis of identity that I had. So I've entitled this sermon, A Holy Identity Crisis. Because when I look at Moses' life, I also see kind of a lifelong identity crisis. I'm guessing he probably feels both gratitude and maybe some survivor's guilt that he avoided having to be enslaved like the rest of his Hebrew family. But I also doubt that he felt full belonging in Pharaoh's palace either. One of the commentators I read wrote, Moses was raised like a dirty secret in the heart of the Egyptian court. And this crisis of identity and belonging comes to a head when Moses witnesses the abuse of an enslaved Hebrew person and kills the Egyptian who is beating him. I don't get the sense this is kind of like a premeditated Luigi Mangione type move. This feels a little more impulsive. It's like he snaps and immediately tries to cover it up by burying this guy in the sand, which is obviously not going to last long. But he doesn't do a great cover-up job, and word gets out. And I wonder, I'm sure Moses was afraid because of that, but I wonder if part of him believes that this act, however rash, will give him some clout, with his fellow Hebrew people. I mean, sure, he lives in the palace, but he's on their side. He's like a vigilante fighter for justice. But the next day when he witnesses this Hebrew on Hebrew infighting and tries to play mediator, they say, who made you the boss or judge over us? They refuse to claim him as one of them. In their eyes, he will always be one of those violent Egyptians. So Moses is not Hebrew enough for the Hebrews and not Egyptian enough for the Egyptians. Have you ever felt like that, kind of caught between two communities or not quite fitting in? And now the Egyptians want him dead for murdering one of them. So he has no people, no identity, no place of belonging. He runs across the desert to Midian, takes on a whole new secret identity, tries to ditch his Egyptian accent, though in verse 19 we see that the daughters of Midian clock him right away as an Egyptian man. But still they take him into their family. And like a fugitive who's been given a fresh start, he keeps his head down and sticks to the straight and narrow, wife, child, steady job, spends his 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s as a humble shepherd. But this identity crisis just follows him and dogs him. We see that he names his son Gershom, which means stranger or foreigner, and signals that, Moses has this continued sense of displacement, of not being at home or with the family or a people. He's giving it to his son as an inherited name. And of course, one day he's leading his sheep to what chapter 3, verse 1 calls the edge of the desert, but the Hebrew phrase literally means beyond the wilderness. I really like that idea, beyond the wilderness, maybe a fitting place for Moses, because nobody really belongs beyond the wilderness. Everyone's a stranger. It's like a no man's land. And then God calls to him out of this mysterious bush. And Moses' first words to God are, I'm here. That's a pretty common phrase. Isaiah says that too when God calls to him. And his second words, which I underlined down in verse 11, are, who am I? There's that old identity crisis again, with a side of low self-worth. Who am I to go to Pharaoh and to bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Now, if I was God, I would have said, well, you're actually kind of the perfect person. You've got this dual Egyptian-Hebrew identity. You're familiar with both worlds and both peoples, and there's a new Pharaoh now, so you're no longer at risk of murder charges. And after 40 years of tending sheep, you might have just built enough character and humility to be ready for this job. But perhaps frustratingly, I am not God, and God does not tell Moses who Moses is. He leaves Moses, she leaves Moses to figure that out for himself. Instead, God says, I will be with you. Wonderful. But this introduces a second holy identity crisis. Okay, you'll be with me, but who are you? Who is this God who promises to be with me? So Moses asks God a second question, underlined in verse 13. He says, "What is your name, God? Who should I say sent me?" And this is a fair question because unlike some of us who grew up in monotheistic settings, Moses grew up in a world that was crammed full of gods, and all of these gods had names. So you had Baal and Asherah and Marduk and Moloch, and the gods of Egypt like Ra and Osiris and Anubis and Horus, who would soon be in direct competition with Moses' God. And usually their names would tether them to some part of the natural world, maybe an animal or a mountain, or perhaps the sun or the moon. Now, back in the book of Genesis, so the book right before this, there were people who gave their own names to God. Like Hagar, who said, "You are the God who sees me." It's one of my favorite names for God. But this story with Moses in Exodus 3 is the first time in the Hebrew scriptures where someone asks God for God's name. "Burning bush God, what do you call yourself?" And if we look at those last two verses of our passage, God actually gives three responses to this question about names. In the first part of verse 14, God says, "Eyeh asher eyeh." And this could be translated in a variety of ways. I am that I am. I will be what I will be. I will prove myself to be what I prove myself to be. Or even, I will become what I choose to become. Kind of puzzling. And then in the second half of verse 14, God gives a shorter version, maybe like a nickname, like what we were talking about earlier. He says, "The I am has sent me to you." This is just the Hebrew word eyeh, which could even mean isness. Just tell them you were sent by the isness. Sure, that will clear things up for everybody. And finally, in verse 15, God gives one more name, a four-letter word that nobody knows how to pronounce. Not even Lyndon, who just read it aloud. Of course, what Lyndon saw and read aloud was the word Lord in all caps, which is what most translators have decided to use every time this unpronounceable four-letter word appears in the Old Testament, which is 6,823 times. I counted them. I'm kidding, I didn't. I found that number in the Wikipedia entry for tetragrammaton, which is a fancy way to say the four letters. And these four letters are roughly in English YHWH, or in Hebrew Yod, He, Vav, He. And they are particularly slippery letters in Hebrew because the H is usually silent and the Y and the W were most often just kind of placeholders for vowels. Now, to spice up the story a little more, when the Old Testament texts were first written down, they had no vowels. It was more than 1,000 years later that the scribes added vowels to the manuscripts as lines and dots underneath the consonants. But when it came to this particular four-letter word, the tetragrammaton, they intentionally left out the vowels because the rabbis wanted it to remain unpronounceable. They considered it too holy, too sacred to be spoken by ordinary people. The rabbis said when you see this word in writing, you should instead say aloud a safer, less sacred word. Some Jews use Hashem, which means the name, but most of them, when they see that four-letter word, they would speak aloud the word Adonai, which means Lord, which is exactly what our English translators are doing here. So basically, over time, the original pronunciation of YHWH was lost, if it was ever truly known in the first place. Latin translators of the Old Testament use Jehovah. Today's linguists suggest it was something more like Yahweh, but we don't know for sure how it's pronounced, and we don't know exactly what meaning it carries. I mean, context clues suggest maybe it's a play on that same verb, hayeh, which means to be or to exist or to happen or to become, but others suggest maybe it's more like imitating a breath, like Yahweh, you know? So to sum all of this up, for all of you who zoned out during that fantastically intriguing biblical linguistics session, God has a name, and it isn't God, and we don't know how to pronounce it, and we don't know what it means, beyond possibly I am or breath. So what's your reaction when you ask God who are you? What's your name? And your God answers, I am that I am. Does it strike you as profound, as beautifully esoteric? Maybe. Does it also maybe frustrate you a little bit? Leave you unsatisfied? It certainly seems to frustrate the writer of our opening reflection song today, Ezra Koenig, a Jewish, I don't know if he would still identify as practicing Jew, but a guy from Vampire Weekend who wrote, through the fire and through the flame, you won't even say your name. Only I am that I am. But who could ever live that way? I am can sound like a non-answer to the identity crisis question. It can feel like God's playing hide and seek, maybe even cheating at hide and seek. Who can live with a God who plays word games and won't fully reveal their identity? I mean, I get it. I get that this God is different. I get that this God cannot be compared, to the sun, like Ra, or represented by an animal, like the falcon-headed god Horus, because this God preceded and is underneath creating all of those things. And I do appreciate that this kind of non-answer points to the kind of God who shatters the names and the images and the boxes that we try to put them in. I like that God is queer in this way, breaking out of all these boundaries and free from all of this. But I still want to know more than just what God isn't, I want to know who this God is. So he seems stuck here. Two unsolved identity crises. Moses doesn't know who he is, and Moses doesn't really know who God is. Or does he? I mean, true, this God can't be tied down to one name or one image. So maybe this is a dynamic God, a God who happens. Maybe the only way to understand this radically free God, the only way to grasp this God's identity is by watching what this God does, by observing how this God acts. And if we look in this passage at some of the verbs, here's what this God does. God hears the cry of suffering enslaved people. God sees their harsh oppression. God understands their pain. God empathizes. God remembers God's promises. And God is moved to action. God comes to liberate them. God comes to find human partners to work with in order to liberate them. Maybe we begin to resolve this identity crisis about God by observing what God does. And maybe Moses will also better understand his own identity by his own actions, by what he does, or maybe by his inaction, because at first, he really does not want to accept this calling that God gives him. I mean, he's pushing back twice in this chapter. He'll do so more times in the next chapter. I'm not good at speaking. And finally in chapter 4, he says, please send someone else. But eventually, Moses says yes. And Moses becomes God's partner in liberation and learns more of who he is by taking the next step. Now, I do want to heed some cautions from disability theologians who would nuance this perhaps by saying that our identity is not only based on what we can do, what we have capacity to act and do. And it's definitely not based on what we accomplish and what we produce or other lies that capitalism might tell us. So maybe it would be helpful to say our identity is also based on whom we choose to identify with, whom we live in solidarity with. So God identified God's self with those who suffered. God puts their full weight behind liberating the poor and the powerless. And it's not that God didn't care about the powerful people. No, God knows the secret that by liberating the powerless, God also liberates their oppressors from the ways that those oppressive acts harm their humanity. So God chooses solidarity with the oppressed for the sake of all. And Moses eventually chooses this too. Moses lays down his life and joins God's movement of liberation. So all this talk of identity crises, identifying ourselves and our God by acts of solidarity. I want to go back to little Beth, who longed to know herself better, and revisit and fill in that story. Beth would discover ways that she was privileged, kind of like Moses, benefiting from empire. And she would discover ways that she was marginalized and made to feel less than. And eventually she would learn about solidarity with suffering people. And this would help her feel and begin to heal some of her own suffering. In the words of Frederick Buechner, she started to find the place where her deep gladness and the world's deep hunger met. And maybe the place where her deep anger and the world's hunger met, because I think anger can also be instructive. And even without a burning bush, it felt a little bit like a call, like my name being whispered, like an invitation to take action, to be in solidarity with specific groups of beloved humans. And much of this took me until my mid-30s. And some is still now being revealed in my 40s, but you know what? It took Moses till his 80s. So it's never too late to respond to a call to partner in liberation. I'm gonna get honest with you here though, y'all. I sometimes feel more like Jacob than like Moses, because I wrestle with this God. I wrestle with trusting God, even when I see God's identity revealed and how God acts. Because even in this very passage, I don't know if you missed it, because Lyndon was doing a really good job of pronouncing these names, but God is talking about freeing one people and then talking about giving them the land of these other indigenous peoples, Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, etc. God is talking about some conflicting actions. Is this a God of liberation or a God of colonization? I mean, more recent centuries of colonizers have certainly claimed this God as inspiration and motivation. Some of these stories they turn to. Like Jacob, I wrestle with a God who is said to have hardened Pharaoh's heart, who is said to have allowed the death of so many firstborn as collateral damage in a kind of divine pissing match, who is said to have sanctioned the genocide of the Canaanites. Now, I deeply hope that these are ways that very human authors of Scripture have taken their own interpretations of these stories and cast God in their own image, as all humans are prone to do. I want to make a quick plug that if these things trouble you as much as they trouble me, you might be interested in an interfaith, anti-Zionist, Jewish and Christian book study that I'm in the midst of co-planning for the fall, looking at the book of Joshua, which is kind of the ultimate book of conquest, and looking at archaeological findings about what actually happened in that part of history. But I'll bracket that and put it to the side for you. But book studies aside, I want to end with a final thought, kind of bringing us out of Exodus and back into Luke for a second. I think we have an advantage that Moses didn't have. Because centuries after Moses died, God revealed another name, a pronounceable name. God actually allowed God's self to be boxed in, to be enfleshed. God showed God's face, God's own image to the world. And this God, whose name was too holy to be pronounced, introduced himself as Emmanuel, God with us. God with us. I will be with you, God said to Moses, but now to all of us, I am with you. And when my idea of God is slippery and I'm kind of sliding down and don't know how to interpret these parts of the Bible that trouble me, or whether I can trust this strange God, I remember that Jesus also said, truly, truly, before Abraham was, I am. And then Jesus said, do not let your hearts be troubled. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. And I still don't fully understand everything Jesus did. He's still at times more strange than familiar, but I do trust the person that Jesus is. I trust the love I see in the life that Jesus lived. The God in the burning bush intrigues me, but the crucified God, the God who suffers with me, the God who lays down their life and calls me to do the same, taking action in love, identifying themselves with sex workers and tax collectors, that's the kind of God I want to follow beyond the wilderness and right back to the heart of empire. That's the God who teaches me my true name and the God whose name I want to keep learning. Will you pray together with me? God of many names, God who can't be boxed in by any one name. We don't know what to call you, but here you are. And so whisper our names to us. Unravel another layer of mystery of who we are. Show us where our deep gladness and our deep anger meet the world's hunger. Show us which particular humans and maybe more than human creatures you've invited us to identify with, to show solidarity with, to take action with and for. Help us to see the open field of possibilities for partnering with you in the liberation of all things. And God, unravel another layer of the mystery of who you are. Help us to see your love in action so that we can trust you. Remind us that you are God with us, that we are not alone, even when we don't know who we are, and even when we don't know who you are. Amen. Caitlin's going to lead us in a song.